Ladies and gentlemen, His Excellency Ambassador Jack Lew, welcome to this special event at the Menachem Begin Heritage Center. Welcome to everyone sitting here with us and to everyone watching on Zoom. I know we have a sizable audience there as well. Those of you who are regulars to our English events know that we typically discuss Israeli, Middle East issues, security, political, other history, the wider Jewish world. This is a little bit different. Everyone here will know, of course, that on March 27th of this year, the Begin Center lost a dear friend, and much more than that, Israel lost a dear friend, and both the Jewish people and the United States lost one of their finest leaders of modern times. The Begin Center is actually, even before Joe Lieberman's passing, the Begin Center was planning to screen a documentary film, a new documentary film about Senator Lieberman in January, and that's still going ahead, so put that in your calendars, January the 8th. But this is something different. It's something that we wanted to do as a center. I'll also just very briefly speak personally that it had a certain resonance for me as well. I first heard Joe Lieberman's name back in the year 2000 when he was mooted as one of the possible candidates to be Al Gore's running mate in that year's presidential election. And I just graduated university. I was interning at the time, actually, at a British newspaper. And I'd been asked to do a bit of research into the candidates. And your typical Brit, certainly someone of my tender years at the time, doesn't know much about, wouldn't have known the names of American politicians probably below the level of president. So when I read that one of the candidates for VP, the senator from Connecticut, was an observant Orthodox Jew, I felt pretty confident that I could tell the seasoned journalists who were not Jewish, who I was working with, that there's no way this guy's going to get picked. An observant Jew as vice president, do me a favor, this is not going to happen. And I felt pretty smug about it. And then, of course, I ended up looking pretty stupid, and I lost all credibility with the journalists I was working with, which I suspect I did not regain. But I became really fascinated in that election. I followed it to its very dramatic conclusion, as many of you will remember. And I became really fascinated in American politics generally, and did a sort of personal crash course in American politics. And I sort of owe that in many ways to Joe Lieberman. And then by complete coincidence, some years later, I met his elder daughter, Rebecca, at a conference, and we became very good friends and chaired a committee together on something or other. If she's watching on Zoom, hi, Rebecca. And then 20 years later, I found myself working with one of Senator Lieberman's granddaughters, who was who was serving here at the Begin Center as a bat shirut, as a religious girl doing national service in lieu of military service. And then finally, belatedly for me, I got to meet the great man himself when he was a guest speaker at a conference here a couple of years ago, the Begin Symposium, and it was really an honor for me to moderate a panel that he was part of. And he was, as I'd heard from everyone up to that point, an absolute mensch. Switching from personal to professional, I'll also add that he was, in so many ways, I think, the perfect keynote speaker for a conference that was inspired by the values and legacy of Menachem Begin, because I think in political discourse today, certainly in the pages of partisan media from left or right, it sometimes seems as though you can either, or you're expected to either prioritize liberal democratic values, civil rights, the rule of law, equality, or prioritize unapologetic patriotism, strong military, reverence for tradition and religion. And what Senator Lieberman had in common with Menachem Begin was that both of them rejected that as a false choice. Both of them were committed liberals in the classical sense of that word. Both men were proud Jews and devoted patriots of their countries. And both men believed firmly that country came before party. And actually, both were willing to go against their parties when they felt that the national interest required it. And something I suspect we would probably all like to see a little more from our political leaders, both Menachem Begin and Joe Lieberman believed that principles were more important than popularity. So this evening, we're going to hear from a number of people who knew and admired Senator Lieberman in various guises. And we're going to start with the President of the State of Israel, Mr. Isaac Herzog.
Shalom, dear friends, from the President's residence in Jerusalem. I'm so pleased to share a few words with you as you gather to honor the memory of a remarkable human being and dear friend of mine and Michal's, Senator Joe Lieberman, Zichrono Livracha. When I think about Joe, one of the first memories that come to mind is a morning breakfast gathering we shared at the President's residence garden not long ago when I had taken office. On that morning, he presented me with a dedicated copy of the Hebrew version of his incredible book on the Jewish spiritual practice of rest, of Shabbat, the Shabbat. To me, this was the true Joe Lieberman. It was no surprise to me that this singular human being, who was one of the most senior Jewish political leaders in the world, and definitely in American history, was also a person of spirit, of ruach, a person who was deeply rooted in the rich offerings of our Jewish tradition, and who was driven throughout his career not just by ambition, but by a profound inner calling. That inner calling was evident in so many ways, from his early years as a student activist for human rights, as an advocate for minorities and for the causes of life and the planet, and for a force behind the establishment of peaceful relations between nations, and of course, as a Jew, with deep concern and love for the State of Israel. His support for Israel was of enormous consequences for the security, well-being, safety of the Jewish people, and for that, we in the State of Israel are eternally grateful to Joe Lieberman. Here now, I reflect on Joe with a sense of sadness and loss, but also with a sense of deep gratitude for the meaningful friendship we shared during his lifetime. And I feel lucky to have shared a final embrace with Joe just months before his passing at the Munich Security Conference. It was me and Michal that he hugged and spoke to, and it was so affectionate and beautiful. I know that the story of his life, his integrity, moderation, and ability to hold different identities with grace has so much to teach all of us now in these dire times of great divisions. I send my heartfelt condolences to Joe's beloved wife Hadassah, a woman of great valor, intelligence, humanity, and heart, who stood by Joe's side throughout, to his wonderful daughter Hani, who is with you today, and to the rest of the family. And I thank everyone honoring Joe's memory today. May his memory be a blessing. Yehi zichro baruch. Toda rabba.
We now have a guest speaker who was not on the publicity for this evening, but who I'm extremely honored was able to join us to speak today. His Excellency Jack Lew, Ambassador of the United States to Israel. He's been in that role since November 2nd, 2023, previously serving as Secretary of the Treasury, White House Chief of Staff, and twice as Director of the Office of Management and Budget. He was also a Deputy Secretary of State in the State Department. Ambassador Jack Lew.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for inviting me to be here with you tonight. And Hani, and to your family, it's sorry to see you here, but it's good to see you. We're here tonight to remember Joe Lieberman. Joe was my friend. We met in the 1980s when he was the Attorney General of Connecticut, and I was a young aide to House Speaker Thomas P. O'Neill. One weekend, I accompanied Mr. O'Neill to Connecticut for a political dinner, and Joe and I were seated together, so it would be easy to serve the two salmon dinners. Over the next 4+ decades, we worked together during the Obama and Clinton administrations on homeland security, budget and government management policies, environmental policies, and much more. On many occasions, we spent Shabbat mornings together at Kesher Israel in Georgetown, and perhaps most importantly, we were parents together at the Jewish Primary Day School in Washington, where Hani and my son Danny represented their classes in student government together. I'm biased, but they made a terrific ticket. Someone recently asked me to describe Joe in a single sentence, and without hesitating, I responded, Joe Lieberman was the rare public figure who was the same in public and private, sincere and respectful, principled and compassionate. Since we on occasion did not share the same policy perspective, I can also say he listened to views contrary to his own. He reflected on them. He would not dismiss alternate views, though he would not budge on deeply held beliefs. When Joe retired from the Senate, he and Hadassah moved to Riverdale in New York, where my wife Ruth and I live. And we had the pleasure to see each other in our new neighborhood in New York at a time when our families were growing and we were welcoming grandchildren into our lives. Joe was deeply rooted in tradition, and he was entirely comfortable explaining his faith and his Jewish practices. As a candidate in 2004, the Secret Service learned about Shabbat protecting Joe and his family. When I found myself with Secret Service protection as White House Chief of Staff and Secretary of the Treasury, I had no need to explain why I'd be walking even if the car would be following. And it was so important to have him as a role model, someone who could run for Vice President of the United States while maintaining the religious and family life that are the foundation of an observant home. On policy, Joe was tireless in his efforts to protect Americans from threats at home and abroad. He was indefatigable in terms of his pursuit of policies to make sure our planet would support future generations, and relentless in making our country and world one in which opportunity would be available to all and freedom would be defended at all costs. I was honored to represent President Obama at a dinner at the Embassy of Israel in Washington, honoring Joe on his career of service. I remember being moved and entertained when his dear friend John McCain regaled the group with the litany of countries he visited with Joe, only to eat the same salmon dinner that he and I shared so many years ago. And while Senator McCain made clear how much he would miss traveling with Joe, he was equally clear that it would be fine if he never again was served salmon for dinner. I'd like to repeat tonight what I said that evening, quoting from Pirkei Avot, Ethics of Our Fathers. Rabbi Shimon said, there are three crowns, the crown of Torah, crown of priesthood, and the crown of royalty. But the crown of a good name is greater than them all of them. Joe Lieberman was a good man who wore the crown of a good name with humility and grace. To Hadassah, Hannah, Matthew, Rebecca, and Ethan, to Joe's sisters, Rita and Ellen, and to his 13 grandchildren, Ruth and I offer our deep condolences with the hope that the rich legacy of Joe Lieberman's public career and the memories of the years you shared will be a source of comfort. And here in Jerusalem, let me offer the traditional words of comfort. Hamakom Menachem Begin Betoch Sharei Evlei Tzion v'Yerushalayim. May you be comforted among the mourners of Zion and Jerusalem.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Lou, for those words. It's now my great pleasure and privilege to welcome to the stage Hani Lowenstein, who made Aliyah with her family in 2018, lives here in Jerusalem with her husband Daniel and their children. She works part-time for the Jewish Learning Initiative on Campus Division of the Orthodox Union. And most importantly, at least for tonight's purposes, Chani Lowenstein is the younger daughter of Senator Joe Lieberman.
I would like to personally thank Paul Gross for organizing this memorial for my father, Zichrono Livracha, at the Begin Center, as well as Rami Shtivi, the Deputy Director of the Begin Center, and Melia Kenyan. Paul was so thoughtful to approach our family with this idea shortly after my father's passing. The Begin Center was just the perfect place for this memorial in light of my dad's deep reverence for Menachem Begin and his connections with the center over the years. On behalf of my family, I want to extend my appreciation to Ambassador Liu, Natan Sharansky, Gil Troy, and Ruth Abramson for speaking this evening. We felt strongly as a family that although we did not sit Shiva in Israel, there should be a memorial here in Israel. This is because of my father's deep connection to the land, both on a personal and political level. His familial connection to Israel traces back to a great uncle, Moshe Segalovich, who is seen as a hero in the family. Born in 1896 in the town of Skidel, he immigrated to Israel in 1912 and became a member of Kfutzat Haroim, literally translated the shepherd group, who, similar to Hashomer, saw the importance of training youth to work and protect the land. Moshe was killed protecting the area of Merchavia in 1918 and was eventually buried in Tel Chai. Another great hero of the family was Uri Segalovich, a cousin of my father's, who my father had a deep connection with. Uri, Zichrono Livracha, was one of the founding generation of the State of Israel. He fought in every war he was physically fit enough to fight in, even when he was exempt from the reserves. And although he was not religious, he seemed to know the Tanakh by heart. My father relished in the time spent with him, and some of my father's first experiences in Israel were with Uri. I'm not certain that earlier in his life, my dad expected that one of his children would make the leap and move to Israel. But when Daniel, the kids, and I made Aliyah 6 years ago, this only strengthened his connection to the land. In his classic way, he took advantage of every experience here that he could. In the last year or so, this included a trip to Hebron, the Qumran Caves, cherry picking in Gush Etzion, our son Akiva's bar mitzvah, and countless other family excursions. Every experience in Israel was just wonderful when you were with my dad, whether it be grabbing some food at a local cafe or walking through the old city to get to the Kotel. That walk took a very long time because he was stopped. If there are tourists, he was stopped the whole way there. He loved the miracle that was and is the State of Israel and the vibrancy of life here. He so enjoyed every moment spent with children, grandchildren, and friends. On a political level, I don't believe he ever felt any sort of dialectical tension between being a patriotic American and an ardent Zionist. The concept of dual loyalty could not be found in the Lieberman dictionary because he saw the interests of the US and Israel as being intertwined. The last 3 months have been challenging and unexpected ones for our family. My father's sudden passing has left us all painfully shocked. But we are certainly taking cues from my dad, who is not one to let things freeze him from action, from doing, from persevering. And so that is our charge as well, to react as he would want us to. Over the past few months, as I've sat and reflected upon my father's life and legacy, upon his midot tovot, his beautiful character traits, there's so much that comes to the surface. At the same time, to distill the personality of a parent is in a way belittling and futile. Yet, I feel there's so much to learn from my dad, and so in that spirit, I'd like to share with you 2 aspects of my father's personality that I think we can all learn from. Traits that have perhaps not been mentioned as much in a public forum and are perhaps something that I can share as a family member. The first was my father's easygoing and calm demeanor. In the midst of what seemed like a whirlwind of projects he was working on, he rarely, if ever, seemed stressed. He had an inner calm to him, and he didn't let the small day-to-day annoyances of life get to him. Small mishaps that happened to us all throughout each week were often laughed at by my father and my mother. May she live until 120. My father was also a flexible person, and so at home, the coffee machine with his favorite coffee would be set up the night before to go off at exactly the right time in the morning. But this didn't mean that when he came to visit us, he needed anything more than instant coffee. And you knew when you were with him that you would seem downright ridiculous to get stressed over small annoyances of day-to-day life. How bogged down do each of us get from the small things that go wrong in our lives, and how much headspace does it take up? My dad didn't let small things impact his mood, and I believe it left him with a very clear head to accomplish everything he accomplished and enjoy life the way that he did. My father was grateful for all his blessings and enjoyed many of the small moments of life that most of us choose to ignore. 2 days before my father died, he remarked on a phone call to a friend, "I have to be one of the luckiest guys on the planet." The morning Moda'ani prayer was not just a line he mumbled each morning as he woke up. It was a guiding principle for each day of his life. He was grateful for his wife, for his family, for his health, even if it wasn't 100%, and for his daily experiences. He was genuinely thankful for another day to live. Everything was done with vitality, a sense of purpose and intention. Whether it was a small, seemingly mundane moment like walking our son to Gan up the street from our home, or even a walk, it might sound silly, to bring the garbage out. When you were around my father, these positive vibes rubbed off on you. They were almost infectious because everything was great, as he would say. Perhaps he was born a naturally positive person, or perhaps it was part of his personality that he cultivated over time. In either case, it's something we can all learn from. My dad's gratitude was in large part rooted in his faith. His religious practice was not a manufactured Judaism. He had a deeply personal connection to his Creator. He began each day with Moda'ani, finished each day with Shema, and davened multiple times a day wherever he was in the world. He enjoyed Torah study and tried to spend time after his daily shachrit learning something. In fact, shortly after he died, I knew that every day he would learn something, and I needed to find what he had learned on the last day of his life. I found the Steinsaltz Chumash and a book of the teachings of Rav Kook on the Parsha bookmarked on just that Parsha of the week. His heart was open to learning and growing. Members of the Iranian opposition in exile attended the Shiva. They had built a relationship with my dad because of his involvement in United Against a Nuclear Iran. As my mother and I spoke with them about my father, I shared with them how we were in shock and pain. At the same time, we can see my father, as he sometimes did with his fist in the air, saying onward, or in Hebrew, kadima. They shared with us that he would end his remarks with the same phrase in Farsi and the same fist in the air when he spoke at their conferences. So I say to each of you here, if you took the time to come here tonight, it means that you were in some way impacted by my dad's life, and so too by his death. And so I say to each of you, onward, kadima. This doesn't mean to forget about his life and legacy, but rather it's a call to action, that each of us moves forward with Yosef Yisrael ben Hanan's life as an inspiration and motivating force in our own lives. God willing, by doing this, we will be able to improve ourselves and impact our families and larger communities. Thank you.
Amen. I think it's the sort of speech that merits that response. Thank you so much, Chani, for those words. We're going to now share with you a series of short video clips, including a wonderful piece that was put together by the McCain Institute, named, of course, for the late Senator John McCain that Ambassador Lou already mentioned was one of Senator Lieberman's closest friends, and also some personal remarks by friends of Joe Lieberman in the United States, including an excerpt from the wonderful eulogy by former Vice President Al Gore at Senator Lieberman's funeral in Connecticut.
He will work with President Gore to keep putting people and progress over partisanship.
You know, political parties are important in our country, but they're not more important than what's best for our country. They're not more important than friendship. They're not more important than our future. And that's why I'm proudly here to urge Republicans and independents in New Hampshire to come out on January 8th and make John McCain the next president of the United States.
The Three Amigos, as done by General Petraeus.
Yes. You forgot to mention he ran for president also and lost, and he'll run and lose someday.
It's just that for so many years I've had to go along with all of Joe's religious nonsense that I might as well convert and get the benefits.
And Joe said, that was great, only I had to have a bris.
And the number one reason I, Joe Lieberman, would make a great president.
Look at me. Do you honestly think there'll be a sex scandal?
No.
Other senators have described our travel as death marches. We go to exotic places like Afghanistan and Baghdad and Libya and those really fun places.
A working relationship of friendship and really based on, I think, values that we all share. We got a lot of things done. I've been privileged to be part of major steps forward in environmental protection, national security, civil rights, human rights, education reform, and every one of those things was bipartisan. Country matters more than party.
Good evening. By way of introduction, my name is Rob Schwartz. I had the honor of being a chief of staff to Joe Lieberman of blessed memory when he was the state Senate Majority Leader in Connecticut. More recently, though, as the founder of Hidden Light Institute, we have just completed a documentary on the life of the senator, and I truly thank Hashem that he had a chance to see 90% of it. In the 40 years I knew him and in working for him as chief of staff, I had a front row seat to see a true statesman, a man who understood the promise of America, who appreciated the sanctity of our democracy, who practiced bipartisanship in bringing different groups and people together, and finally, who acted with civility as a great example of how we must all act during these vitriolic times. It was a blessing to have had my life touched by him. And for all of us who have worked on this documentary, which will be shown at the Begin Heritage Center, we ask Hashem to bless the neshama of Joseph Lieberman.
Joe Lieberman was a model of how public life should be conducted, and an important figure in American Jewish history. His life and political career were tributes to the famous words once spoken by Abraham Lincoln. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Joe was a historic figure in American Jewish history in two ways. First, his nomination for the vice presidency in 2000. That was the first time a Jew had been on a major party ticket. But also his career and his life carried an additional meaning, that an Orthodox Jew, a faithful and observant Jew, could succeed fully in America without assimilating, without leaving behind his religion. There was no one in politics in his lifetime who did more to remind us, quoting Lincoln again, of the better angels of our nature, of how politics could be conducted with optimism and principle and with tolerance and religious faith.
We were close on climate, on civil rights, human rights, women's rights, LGBTQ rights, and so many other issues. And so that closeness was formed before I chose him to be my running mate in 2000, but then our relationship and that between our families became extraordinarily close, a very significant relationship. We laughed together, fought like hell together for what we wanted our country to be, prayed together, thought for a season we had won together, but, well, you know that part of the story. You win some, you lose some, and then there's that little-known third category. Politics can be a rough trade. As a recovering politician, I can certainly testify to that. The stakes are high. The pressures are great. Joe and I experienced those. But he always knew, beyond doubt, the true value of things. I saw him ready to reclaim friendships that had been seared by disagreements, ready to look for ways to bridge divisions, ready to seek reconciliation, ready to stand for his principles, always, even when that independence left him exposed to partisan anger from both sides.
Okay, I want to just briefly draw your attention to something that Rob Schwartz mentioned there, the documentary film that we're screening here at the center. Get January the 8th in your calendars. That's going to be screened here. Okay, on with our program. Our next speaker needs little introduction. Well, I'm going to give it a go. The name of Nathan Sharansky is synonymous with the struggle for the freedom of Soviet Jewry, and he's become one of the world's great advocates for democracy and freedom, and one of the most powerful voices we have for unapologetic Jewish and Zionist pride. He's a former chairman of the Jewish Agency, a former member of Knesset, government minister, deputy prime minister, and the author of a number of highly influential books, including most recently co-authored with Gil Troy, who we'll hear from later, Never Alone, Prison Politics, and My People. Nathan Sharansky.
Well, Annie and the family, Your Excellency, my good friend, Jack and Ruth Lou, and all of you, my dear friends. Well, on my way before coming, I thought about some points which I want to mention, and then all these points were mentioned here. So, but because they were not mentioned by everybody, so I'll repeat some of them. A couple of years ago, I asked for a meeting with Secretary of State Blinken. I was and I am the chairman of the board of the Memorial Center Babi Yar. And though it was a couple of months before the war of the aggression of Russia against Ukraine, there were some tensions, and I felt it's worth sharing them with the Secretary of State, and also the questions of human rights, dissidents in Iran and other places. And I thought it would be easy to get this meeting because Secretary of State's stepfather was very involved in Soviet Jewry, so somehow it became a little bit complicated, confused, it was postponed. And then when I was speaking with somebody from the staff, and I said, by the way, I'm going to come together with Joe Lieberman. He said, oh, why didn't you say it before? And of course. And I immediately got the meeting. It reminded me like 10 or 15 years before, in 2007, I think, or 8. Together with Václav Havel, we were organizing the meeting of the democratic dissidents from all over the world, and mainly from Arab countries. And it was a couple of years before the Arab Spring, 3 years before, year and a half before what happened later in Iran revolution. But nobody really believed in any meaning or any power of the democratic dissidents in Arab countries. But because it was a topic very close to the heart of President Bush, so I was convincing his staff that President should come, though it seemed to them, with this distance, you can never know. They'll start attacking him, saying why your policy here in our country is so bad, why you're supporting dictators. But on the other hand, he did want to participate. And I said, of course, it will be bipartisan. And his chief of staff said, and who'll be from Democratic Party? They said, Joe Lieberman. Oh, of course, of course. So you see, Joe Lieberman is a good trade, Taudat Kashrut for everybody. And I found out what a good name it is. And on this thing for a moment, he was on the ticket of the vice president for Democratic Party, and he almost made it to be on the ticket of as a vice president from Republican Party, and it's in the next elections. Well, we know in Israeli politics people who are among the leaders of one party, and the next election they're among the leaders of the other party, and they always connected with the fact that they're changing their views or their interests. But Joe never changed his views. It is the parties who were changing their views. And such a moral clarity and such a conviction. And that's why I think he was attracting people by the fact that everything was clear. Nothing is clear in politics. There are so many different things that are happening and so. But with him, it was clear, it was simple, and everybody could rely on it, that it will not change. And coming then to the next point of everybody was mentioning, to be Jewish and to be politician of the big of the old. And Jack, of course, can tell more than almost anybody else how difficult was the life of Orthodox Jew in Washington in the 70s and the 80s. Probably today is much easier. But we know many politicians who were good Jews at home and were changing their way of life when they were moving to the office. And we know in Israel, I can give you many names, I will not give you, but I know many Israeli politicians who feel that they have to be very Jewish in their public life and much less at home. For Joe, it was so smooth to move from the office at home with all these discomforts which Jack and John McCain mentioned, but it was so natural for him. And it was so easy for him. There was nothing artificial in this. It was like goes without saying. And this connection between to be Jew and to the man of the world, to be universalist and to be nationalist. It's such a difficult collision in many cases. Well, of course, I felt it when I was in Moscow, Jewish activist, being involved in Jewish movement and human rights movement and all the complaints from both sides. In the last dozen years, we all know how difficult it is to be proud Zionist and at the same time proud fighter for Tikkun Olam. Nobody trusts you. Or you're here or you're there. It cannot be together. With Joe Lieberman, who was so Jewish, so proudly Jewish. It's, well, not only because I saw him with his family in our sukkah, or I saw him in the synagogue in Washington, or in many conversations or appearing together about Jewish Shabbat. So no doubt, he was by far more educated, knowledgeable Jew than me, by far. And no, I proposed him to be the member of our board in Babi Yar. He said, you know, Hadassah says that he will not let me back at home if I'll be a member of another board. I really can't. But then he thought for a moment, but Babi Yar. And I said to him, look, you don't have to do anything. Once in a year, we have a discussion, conversation. You can do it by Zoom. And then he said, no, probably he spoke to Hadassah. I don't think that he took chance not to be permitted back to home, but he agreed. At the moment he agreed, he went to our meetings. Then he went together with Hadassah to Kyiv, Babi Yar, then went to the place from where their family was. And he was so emotionally involved. And then after this, but there was a lot of politics, of course, everywhere there is a lot of, and here with Ukraine, with Russia, with the Soviet Union, a lot of politics with the positions of different oligarchs, those who helped and those who didn't help. And he helped me a lot to keep it simple, to keep it moral, to keep it Jewish. It was such a pleasure to have him already not as a politician, but as an advisor in something which is so close to his heart. So it's about being Jewish. And by the way, the best proof how Jewish he is, that he had a sense of humor which is sarcastic, but which is not cynical, and he knew how to laugh on his opponents, on his people, on Israel, and on himself. And that's the best proof that he was really, really deeply Jewish. And then, on the other hand, about human rights, there is so much confusion about it. You know, like take the Arab Spring. And just before, how people, also in Washington, are explaining to me and to the others that Mubarak is such, by the way, here our leaders in Jerusalem, that Mubarak is such a valuable person, and stop this talking about human rights. We need him. He is the person of the future, the person, so on, so on. And then happens what happens, and the same politicians which only 3 days ago were explaining why nobody should touch Mubarak, start explaining how about Arab Spring, how it is natural to expect, and that people want to be free. And I quote New York Times that if Bibi Netanyahu will not make peace immediately, he will be the last dictatorship in the Middle East, because now everybody will be free and democratic. And then, of course, Muslim brothers come and they say, okay, you see, human rights are not from Middle East. And so every 2 years, you have to change your point of view. And here coming 2 guys, Joe Lieberman, Democrat, Jewish, Orthodox Jewish, and John McCain, Christian, Republican. And each time when they were on their way to Egypt or to Iraq, and so on, they usually were coming to Jerusalem, and we had great conversations. And they don't need to change their views. They're saying the same all the time, because they really believe in this deep connection between identities, between people, and between human rights and freedom. And it was so deep in them. And there was absolutely no contradiction between that one is Orthodox Jew and other is Christian, and they all believe in Tikkun Olam and believe in the desire or nature of the people to be free. And when I was thinking a lot why there is such a mutual feeling between them, John McCain is clear from where he takes it. He was in prison. When we had very similar experience, that's why I think we felt like kindred spirits from our first meeting in '87, the first time that I came to America. But Joe was not in the prison. But this experience of Jewish people, how important it is, how important it is to keep this connection between desire to be free, between liberty and your tradition. And it was so deep, and that's why they were like very natural partners. And it was such a pleasure to see them all together. And the last moment I remember, I came to to Senate, and he knew that I'm coming. We agreed to meet. I came with Palestinian dissident Bassam Aid, and he was very glad to get to know him. And he invited some young senators from just the one who was elected from Florida, Rubio. Yeah, then it was his first year, and some other senators who were really their first year. And he started telling them about struggle for Soviet Jewry. They had no idea. Well, today in Israel hardly has anybody some idea about it, but they had absolutely no idea what did President Reagan, about the Senator Jackson, and about all the struggle. And he was giving them a lecture showing how powerful America can be in the world. And he was so proud as a Jew, and he was so proud as American. And this atmosphere was influencing everybody. And I think today, when we are speaking so often about that, there are people who are, well, with the new anti-Semitism prospering today in the United States of America. And it's so clear how it goes together with the anti-Americanism. And those who are raising Hamas flags, they are burning the flags in the American universities, flags of Israel and of the United States of America. And it is difficult to explain to people that it's not a challenge to Zionism, it's a challenge to American values. And there was no better person who could explain it. And we need, and we miss him terribly, as Joe Lieberman. Thank you.
Thank you, Natan Sharansky. This theme of Joe Lieberman being deeply Jewish is going to be continued by our next speaker, Ruth Gebeza Abramson, who got to know Senator Lieberman while serving as CEO of She'arim, fulfilling Israeli Judaism, and as founder of the National Institute for Shabbat Society and Economy and the Shabbat Unplugged initiative, which we're going to hear about. Ruth is a graduate of the Mandel School for Educational Leadership, where she focused on developing the concept of Jewish values in public life, in Israeli public policy. She also has a PhD from the Sorbonne on the connection between a common ethos and governability in Israel. And today she is CEO of the Association for the Advancement of Community Centers in Israel and head of cross-sector collaboration, Israel Association of Community Centers. Ruth Gebeza Abramson.
Friends, family, and all who cherish Joe. It's hard to believe we're here today remembering a man who touched so many lives, Senator Joe Lieberman. While I knew Joe for only a relatively short period, it was full of rich and deeply impressive interactions. As I stand before you, my heart is full of memories and gratitude for the time I shared with Joe. I first met Joe and his beloved wife Hadassah in Beit Shemesh, Israel. From that very first encounter, it was clear that Joe wasn't just visiting. He was in the place he felt most at home, Eretz Israel. What struck me most was how he carried himself. Here was a man who had reached the heights of American politics, yet he moved through a shopping mall in the Israeli periphery with the same warmth and authenticity he might have shown in the halls of Congress. That day, I had one goal: to recruit Joe as the president of the National Shabbat Institute we were establishing. To my delight, he immediately said yes. From that moment on, he poured his heart and soul into advancing the Institute's work, demonstrating his deep love, arbe ahava, for our tradition and our people. Joe saw the Shabbat as more than just a religious observance. For him, it was the heart of Jewish life and identity. In his beautiful book, about Shabbat, the gift of rest. He captured its sweetness, its family-centered nature, and its power to build communities. Reading it, you could feel the joy he found in being part of this ancient tradition. His approach to Shabbat wasn't about restrictions, but about the pleasure and delight it brings. וקראת לשבת עונג, as we say in the Kiddush, you shall call the Shabbat a delight. This perspective shaped our work at the Institute. We focused on how Shabbat could strengthen social cohesion, bringing people together to create positive experiences and build trust. We explored Shabbat's relevance to modern challenges like climate change, emphasizing the importance of day when we pause our exploitation of world resources. We even study how Shabbat rest could boost economic productivity. Through programs for local authorities and Israeli Shabbat conferences, we worked to bring these ideas to life. Joe believed deeply that Shabbat was one of the mechanisms that preserved the Jewish people more than anything else throughout our long exile. Despite all the hardships we faced, Shabbat provided a shared day of rest, allowing communities to come together and maintain our collective identity. His ne'emanut, his faithfulness, his loyalty to this tradition was unwavering and inspiring. As our national poet Bialik said, if one had to choose one, or just one, of the 10 commandments, it would be Shabbat, because within it are folded all 10 commandments and all of Judaism. Joe saw Shabbat in much the same way as the cornerstone of Judaism and the Jewish world. Joe's favorite holiday was Shavuot, which I don't think was a coincidence. He was fully committed and connected to the receiving of the Torah. This reminds me a story he once told me. During one of his local election campaigns, an elderly Christian woman approached him and said that she and her friends decided to vote for Joe Lieberman because, even though he wasn't Christian, his deep commitment to his own tradition spoke values about his character and trustworthiness. Joe understood something profound that many leaders today miss, that being authentically yourself can be your greatest strength. This story taught me an important lesson, that it highlights how much, and it highlights how much we lack such leaders today. Joe showed us that we can be true to ourselves and to your values, your nation, and your tradition, and still success in the border world. In fact, it's precisely this authenticity that can win people trust and respect. Joe walks through life balancing two essential qualities. On the one hand, he had an immense love for everything he did, a deep dedication to the Jewish people, and unwavering loyalty. On the other, he held a great ir'ah, reverence for God and Torah. He saw himself as a link in a chain, following in the footsteps of his parents and grandmother. He balanced these aspects, love and reverence, with wisdom and good sense, always interpreting tradition with both loyalty and innovation. We miss Joe. I don't know of any Jewish leader in the world today who can hold both the public service aspects, committed, serious, and professional, and the identity aspects in the way Joe did. To honor his memory and fill some of the void he left, I invite you all to find one small way to make your Shabbat more meaningful. And if you are involved in Jewish education, consider making Shabbat central to your curriculum. Let this action be for Ilui Nishmato, for his elevation of his soul. I want to take a moment to honor Hadassah. May she be blessed with long and good life. Joe relied a great deal on Hadassah. He trusted her, he valued her opinion, loved her deeply, and admired her. Hadassah helped him stay true to the special path he chose. The partnership between them spoke of love and mutual respect. I send you, Hadassah, a big hug and heartful condolences. You continue to bring light to the Jewish people, carrying forward the legacy you built together with Joe. And to Hani, he often spoke of the joy you brought him, of your commitment to the Jewish path you've chosen, and of the sweet grandchildren you brought into the world. Your choices and your family were a source of a lot of nachat for him. Joe's life was a testament to the power of living with integrity, faith, and a dedication to one's principles. He showed us how to bridge world, the political and the spiritual, the traditional and the modern. His legacy challenged us to live up to our highest ideals, to serve our communities with devotion, and to never lose sight of the values that guide us. As we move forward, as Hani said, let us carry Joe's memory in our hearts. Let his wisdom inspire us, his courage embolden us, and his love for our traditions strengthen us. May we honor him by striving to embody the qualities he so beautifully exemplified: ahava, love, ir'ah, reverence, and ne'emanut, loyalty. Joe's memory will forever be blessed, we are blessing, and may his soul be bound up in the bond of eternal life. Amen.
Thank you so much for those really inspiring and beautiful words, Ruth. We're going to continue with, having heard so many wonderful things about Senator Joe Lieberman, we're going to hear a few words from the man himself. We have a short video of clips from the panel that he was part of here a couple of years ago. In addition to the important words that you'll hear about the importance of consensus building and compromise, I'll draw your attention to his remarks at the end, which I think are even more relevant today than when he said them.
Again, I think Begin's life is really instructive for us on this. First, I would say, and I do spend a lot of time on this now, particularly trying to convince members of the U.S. Congress that there's a lot more satisfaction, even pleasure, from figuring out how to balance principle and pragmatism than the constant tribal division and the lack of accomplishment that seems to characterize Congress now. Part of his legacy to us is patriotism, and to know not only when to compromise, but when to yield, if you will. And of course, the Altalena incident is an example of that. He put the nation and its future first. That's the highest form of compromise. And of course, when the '67 war broke out, he did not hesitate. He rushed to join a unity government because he felt there was an existential threat to Israel. So those were all compromises. And look, to put it, if I was speaking to a room full of politicians, there's a couple here, and I always say this in the U.S., the compromises Begin made led to the extraordinary accomplishments of his career that we celebrate and honor and learn from today. All that I've mentioned, particularly the peace treaty with Egypt, but his patriotism, his willingness to put the country first. And I always say that in the U.S. Senate, where I was privileged to be for 24 years, big headlines, big debates on the floor. But in one sense, it is 100 people, senators, going to work in the same place. And to a remarkable extent, one's ability to get something done that you want depends on your colleagues' trust in you, but also whether they like you or not. You know, seems strange, but it really matters. To focus on the Jewish students, there is a core of Jewish students who are really willing, courageously stand up and fight. But the troubling part is the significant number. Maybe it's, I asked the students, I'm not on campus, Jewish students, probably at least half, who are non-involved. They're apathetic. Now, why are they apathetic? Let's be honest. Some of them, don't bother me with this. I want to go to college. I want to have a good time. I want to learn. But even that is a reflection, and this brings me back to Begin. I don't think they know Jewish history. I think they have grown up in a just amazingly wonderful time for Jews in America. Opportunity all over, barriers falling. And even the Shoah, which they know about, of course, seems like from another time.
I think you'll get what I meant by those closing remarks. This was, of course, just a snapshot of the many wise and important observations that he made at that event. And that event is obviously one of many thousands in which he contributed his great insights and wisdom and integrity over the decades. Okay, for the final part of our proceedings this evening, I would like to invite to the stage Professor Gil Troy for a conversation about Joe Lieberman's significance and uniqueness as an American Jewish figure, as well as being a great friend of the center. Gil is, I think, the perfect person for such a conversation. He's both an award-winning historian of American politics, but also a prolific writer, an activist on Zionism and Jewish identity. He's the author of over a dozen books. Many of them we've launched here at the center, and his essays and op-eds have been published in multiple American, Canadian, and Israeli publications, and you can also read him weekly in the Jerusalem Post. Gil Troy. Okay, yes, that works. Gil, great to have you with us. So I wanted to start with, when I was preparing for this, I found the response from the White House to news of Joe Lieberman's passing. There was a statement in the name of President Joe Biden where he said, his historic bid for the vice presidency as the first Jewish candidate on a major party ticket took our nation one step closer to realizing the full promise of America. So I wanted to ask you, as someone who is yourself a born and bred American Jew, but also a keen observer of these things, what do you think it meant in the year 2000 for American Jews to have this man, this observant Orthodox Jew, on the ticket for the White House?
Thank you. First of all, I'm honored to be here. And unlike everybody else, I didn't know Joe Lieberman very well. We actually had a long conversation shortly after that speech.
That panel, yeah.
But I'm here as the outside validator, just as a historian who had the privilege of watching his career and being inspired by his career. And before I get to 2000, let me get to 2024. I'm a little overwhelmed. Neshama, Yirat Shamayim, moral clarity, salmon instead of steak. And a successful politician, that doesn't go together. And what's so extraordinary is, I think, not just successful politician, but the most successful Jewish politician. One of the things I think we're hearing is that Joe Lieberman didn't just die at the age of 82. He was 248 years old. He lived an American life. And he was 3,500 years old. And I think his moral clarity, I think his greatness came from understanding that politics isn't just about winning that moment or being in that moment, but transcending that moment. And at this crazy moment in American history, when we have progressives who don't believe in progress and conservatives who don't conserve institutions, to hear about Joe Lieberman, who actually was a progressive who believed in progress. We haven't mentioned it enough, but he was there in 1963 at the Civil Rights March, One of the reasons why Al Gore was so moved to nominate him was precisely because he represented that generation of Americans who said, yes, I may be white passing, or whatever they call them these days. I'm white, but I'm not just going to hide behind my privilege. I'm going to stand up for our black brothers and sisters. And he also, as a Jew, understood they to live your principles. But in 2000, when he was nominated, to really understand the power of that moment, we have to go back to the day that Joe Lieberman almost committed political suicide. September 3rd, 1998. September 3rd, 1998, Bill Clinton, who's president of the United States, is in a scandal of scandals, the Monica Lewinsky scandal. But the code of omerta in the Democratic Party didn't just start in 2024. It's there too. No one is breaking with the president because Ken Starr is evil, because anybody who dares question Bill Clinton's behavior is a liar, is a prude. And Joe Lieberman has known Bill Clinton since 1970. What should he do? I can only imagine how nervous he was September 2nd at night. I can only imagine how nervous he was over breakfast on September 3rd. And he gets up in the well of the United States Senate, not knowing if this could be the end of his career. And he talks about morality. And he talks about the presidency. And he talks about the president bettering us. And lo and behold, Bill Clinton ultimately lifts up the phone and says, I kind of agree with everything you said. And because of that moment, that is why Al Gore nominates him, and that's why Joe Lieberman became Joe Lieberman. He went from being a senator who probably wouldn't have had this memorial, or, you know, well-known, well-liked guy, into the stratosphere because he lived his principles, because he stood up and he said truth to power. And I think that was a very Jewish moment. And so in 2000, when Al Gore nominates him, that validates his political courage. But also for us as Jews, it's like, wow, we belong, we pass, we fit. We tell the stories of him walking back and forth the 4.5 miles from his apartment to the Senate to vote, but not pressing the electronic button. And the poor Secret Service men in the rain, but sort of ultimately, as we heard, understanding what was going on, and then passing it on to successors, and being a true role model, a true trailblazer. So at that moment, it was inspiring. I have to confess a little bit, I also was a little put off sometimes because of all the Borscht Belt humor, because I was of a different generation. And I was a generation that said, don't tell jokes about your mother, don't tell jokes about being Jewish. But he was right, I was wrong.
Yeah, it's the point Nathan Sharansky made about how he lives his principles and how he didn't change, the parties changed. So that point with Clinton, and also when he was fated by Republicans because he ran as independent and then he endorsed John McCain, and it would have been the easiest thing in the world for him then to just say, okay, I'm sort of, switching parties and I'm now going to cozy up to the Republicans. But he still continued to vote with his liberal principles, even at the cost of alienating right-wing friends in the Senate, because as Ruth said, it was authenticity was the thing. And I wanted to, so you wrote a book, one of the many books that you wrote, was called Leading from the Center, Why Moderates Make the Best Presidents, which made me think of Joe Lieberman, even though he wasn't president, of course, but he himself wrote a book a couple of years ago called The Centrist Solution, How we made government work and can make it work again. And I wondered how you would understand or describe the nature of Lieberman's centrism or moderation, or the way that he saw that. He also mentioned it in the clips that we showed here.
Well, that's what we talked about in the hallway that day.
Really?
Yeah, we sort of, we had that centrist bonding.
Very nice.
Read the New York Times obituary. I'm a professor, so I can't get in front of an audience without giving some homework. The New York Times obituary of Joe Lieberman is a prose poem exactly to centrism. They talk about him as a man of principle, and yet with an ability to compromise. Now, compromise in American history sometimes is a bad word, right? If you're a compromiser, it means you don't have a strong sense of principle. But we just heard how he squared that circle. Because to be a true moderate, to lead from the center, is not to be a marshmallow moderate. It's not just to say, oh, I'm going to get hit from the left, I'm going to hit from the right, so therefore I must be okay. It's to be what I call a muscular moderate. And that's what Joe Lieberman was. A muscular moderate means I have a set of principles, I have a core set of ideals, but I also have a higher set of principles. And sometimes I'm willing to lose, and sometimes I'm willing to gain. But ultimately, I want to make sure that we go forward. And you could hear the pain in his voice over the dysfunctionality of the modern Congress. And why? Because I'm spending more time playing to CNN or MSNBC or Fox News, if I'm playing more to the extremists, if I'm playing more to the bleachers, and I'm not really rolling up my sleeves and making it happen, then I'm not going to get it done. And so centrism is about what you do behind the scenes sometimes. And centrism, he was right, is also about relationships. I once heard many, many years ago, and it helped me kind of understand politics, Barney Frank, before he entered the Congress when he was in the Massachusetts state legislature. He said, you got to understand, everybody talks about politics, and they talk about big ideas and principles. It's like being in the boys' locker room when you're in high school. Who's up, who's down, who's cool, who's in, who's out. And it's about relationships and building a sense of team. And if you're not a part of the team, if you don't know how to work with others, then you're on the outs and you don't get anything done.
Yeah, and another thing that came up thinking about this event and listening to some of the talks was, it's not just that he was Jewish, but he was religious. He was shomer mitzvot. I mean, that was so unusual. And he was by no means the only Jewish member of Congress, but he was, I assume, one of the very few who was religious in this way. And of course, as Ambassador Lewis also. How do you think that spoke to Jews, but also I'm thinking, and it relates to something Ruth said about the Christian who approached him and said that she admired his authenticity, so to religious Americans of other faiths who would see in Joe Lieberman someone who was a deeply religious, reverential man, and that also spoke to them.
There's an upside and a downside. We'll start with the downside, which is Ellen Willis, sardonic but very clever writer for The Village Voice, when Joe Lieberman was nominated and saw his religiosity, said, he's like a Christian evangelical in Jewish drag. And that was not a compliment. And what's so interesting is that he was a Joe Lieberman Jew, not a Bernie Sanders Jew.
Right.
And I'm going to be a little controversial.
Go for it.
One of the last things he published was an article in the Wall Street Journal calling out Chuck Schumer and saying, you are not Shomer Yisrael. You've crossed a line in your attack on Israel. You've crossed a line at this critical moment in Israel's life. And just 3 months earlier, he had an article published on Fox News where he said, I'm lucky. I never experienced anti-Semitism. And I said the same thing. I was on the college campus for decades. I never experienced anti-Semitism. I can't believe what our students are going through today. It breaks my heart. And the question is, where's America going? And what does it mean? And so, yes, I think what Joe Lieberman was able to do was speak a common language with Christian evangelicals, speak a common language back when Democrats weren't all secular and Republicans weren't all religious. Speak a language of, yes, Jesus, and of values and of Bible, because he understood, and it goes back to that speech he gave on September 3rd, 1998. Read the speech. It's, first of all, an extraordinary analysis of what the presidency is. And he quotes Clinton Rossiter and James David Barber and Richard Neustadt, all the people I used to assign in my courses on the American presidency. But it also talks about morality. It talks about the coarsening of American culture. It talks about a cult of sexual promiscuity. It talks about an undermining of faith. And I think Al Gore understood, Al Gore from the South, in the wake of Bill Clinton, who also was from the South, but also had the question of moral turpitude hanging over him. How do we show that as Democrats, we're people of values? How do we show that as Democrats, we're not going to let the Republicans monopolize family, faith, and flag? That has to be a shared set of values. And by the way, successful liberal politicians like Barack Obama, like Bill Clinton, like Al Gore understood that, and like Joe Lieberman. And so Joe Lieberman, despite being a Jew, because he was a religious Jew, because he was a man of faith, and because he was a man of principle, was able to reach out to the vast majority of Americans who, whether they're religious or not, want to believe, want to be moral, want to have a sense that the government and the country means something and stands for something. And that's why his loss is such a loss.
Yeah, and that same moral compass, which spoke to religious Americans, also spoke to Americans for whom civil rights were important, because that was also part of his moral code, right? That was also something that he believed in.
And by the way, we should bring in African Americans.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
Because African Americans have a very religious language.
Right.
Right. And so here was somebody who had credibility with African Americans because he had gone down south, because he knew what it was, because he'd been attorney general, because he had fought for civil rights, because he knew where they had been. And he himself, when he entered Yale in the in the 60s and 70s, was still at a time when to be a Jew at Yale was not so normal. So he understood what that was. But his language wasn't just one of dismissal of tradition, but of deep tradition and being able to speak the language of the Black church, the language of the Black community.
Yeah, yeah. I'm going to end with a question which is sort of in two parts. So you're a historian, as we know. So the two questions are, how will historians writing and teaching American political history remember Joe Lieberman? And the second, which is slightly different, is how will historians of American Jewry remember?
So first of all, I do want to extend the deepest condolences to his amazing family and to all the friends who loved him. And I think to know him was to love him. And when he died, it was so upsetting to me. First of all, because he wasn't going to see the happy ending that we're going to have right here in Israel. He wasn't lucky enough. He was unfortunately lucky enough to see October 7th, but not understand that we are a resilient people, that we will survive, that we will thrive, and that a year or two or three, we're going to be stronger and better. And it breaks my heart that he didn't see that. But I have a feeling that he was the kind of guy who knew that. Even more upsetting and even more confusing to me as a historian, both as an American historian and as an American Jewish historian, is right now I don't know how I would write about Joe Lieberman. Will he be the high point of American Jewish life? Will he be a symbol of what we could have had and what we did have? By the way, notice on Thursday, no one can get together without mentioning the debate. But what did people not mention? That the two anchors, Dana Bash and Jake Tapper, were Jewish, and once upon a time, pre-October 7th, that would have been like a high point in American Jewish history. And the fact that we didn't even mention it, or barely mentioned it, is because there's so much else going on, there's so much static, but also it's become so normative. But the question is, will the next generation of American Jews, the young ones, have that same experience? Be able to be Ambassador Lou, be able to be Jake Tapper, be able to be Dana Bush, be able to be Joe Lieberman? I certainly hope so. But right now, it looks like he might be a reflection of what they're saying is the golden age. Now, I'm an optimist, and I still have such fundamental faith in the decency of the American people. I still have such fundamental faith in the power of the Constitution. I still have such fundamental faith in what I call the silenced majority, that, as Natan said, I don't believe they want to go with the flag burners and the traffic disruptors and those who throw red paint on the White House. I believe they want to go with the Jewish people and with the people of Israel and with American values and with democracy and with Western civilization. It may take a while to get there, but I believe we'll get there. But it's terrifying to me that I can't stand up right now, because I'm a historian. I always say it's hard enough to predict the past. I can't begin to predict the future. But that I can't say with certainty, Joe Lieberman will be seen as one more link in the chain of Jewish success in America and of Jewish normalization in America, and the ability to be both successful as a Jew outside your home and inside your home, and as an American, as what we call a real person. The fact that there's a question mark hanging over us is terrifying and unacceptable. And all of us have to call on our friends, our Jewish friends and our non-Jewish friends, to make sure that it doesn't happen. To defend Joe Lieberman's legacy, to defend America, and to defend the West.
Thank you very much, Gil Troy. I sometimes think that one of the very few silver linings, if you like, of the situation that we're seeing outside of Israel with the demonstrations is that many people that I think were previously apathetic or didn't think about it or didn't care about it, about Israel, the Middle East, whatever, are seeing with their own eyes that the people who march against Israel and de facto, or sometimes even explicitly, for Hamas are also anti-American, are also anti-Britain, are also anti the West, and that's very clear in the nature of the demonstrations. And that, I think, is something that Joe Lieberman was such a perfect sort of advocate for that understanding of the world. I want to thank all the speakers that spoke so wonderfully and beautifully and inspiringly today. Fanny Lowenstein, of course, His Excellency Ambassador Jack Lew, Natan Sharansky, Ruth Kabes Abramson, and Gil Troy. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Paul, for putting this together. Bravo.
Have a great evening. Bye.